know the moment, not the idea. The moment after you say it out loud. When you finally tell someone what you've been thinking about. That thing you've been carrying quietly. The plan, the vision, the version of your life that feels just out of reach, but real enough that it won't leave you alone. And the second you say it, something shifts. Not outside, inside. They look at you differently. They lean in. They nod. Maybe they smile in a way that feels like recognition. And then they say it. That's insane. That's huge. You're actually going to do that. And right there, something happens that you don't question. Because it feels good. It feels like confirmation. Like something just became real. Like you crossed a line. Like you moved forward. But you didn't. You felt like you did. And that difference is where everything begins to collapse. Because in that moment, before you built anything, before you tested anything, before you failed, adjusted, struggled, or even started, you experienced something that should only come at the end, recognition. And your system does not separate the two. It doesn't say, this is just a conversation.
It's not
It
just a
says,
country
this is happening.
filled with this,
It says,
this
is real.
and this.
It says, we're already moving.
It's a
And that's the
land
problem.
of openness.
Not that you shared the
like
idea,
really
but you felt
open.
the result without earning the process. Because once the feeling
Open
is
roads
there,
that stretch
the
for
drive
miles,
changes.
open
Suddenly,
mountains that seem to go
but
on
completely.
forever,
You walk
and
away
open
from
cities that breathe
conversation,
with space
and for a
and
few
freedom.
minutes, you are different.
But
You
that
feel
openness
sharper,
is only the
clearer,
beginning
more certain,
of what
like
makes
something
Canada
locked into place. And
extraordinary.
if someone asked you right then, are you going to do it? You wouldn't hesitate.
Today,
Yes,
I'll take you on a
without
journey
doubt,
to experience the
without
true
hesitation. And you
essence
believe it.
of Canada.
That's the dangerous part.
Exploring its most
You actually
breathtaking
believe it.
destinations,
Because in
discovering
that
hidden
moment,
gems,
you're not
and
lying.
uncovering the rich
You are fully
cultural
convinced.
highlights
But
that
then
make
something
each
happens.
place truly special.
Not dramatic, not obvious. It fades, slowly, quietly. You don't notice the exact moment it leaves. Just wake up one day, and the intensity is gone. The urgency isn't there. The clarity feels distant. The plan is still good, still makes sense, still sounds powerful when you think about it. But the energy that was supposed to move it forward is no longer accessible in the same way. And now you start explaining it. I've just been busy. I need to organize things first. I want to do it right. I'll start soon. But underneath all of that, there's something else. Something you don't say. Something you don't fully admit. It doesn't feel as alive anymore. And that's what confuses you. Because nothing went wrong. No one stopped you. Nothing failed. Nothing collapsed. But somehow, you're not moving. And so you default to the easiest explanation. Discipline, motivation, consistency. You tell yourself you need more of it, more structure, more focus, more effort. But what if none of that is the problem? What if the issue isn't that you don't follow through, but that something already happened before you ever had the chance to? Because from a psychological standpoint, what you experienced in that moment was not encouragement. It was completion, artificial, premature, but real enough for your system to respond to it as if it counted. And once that happens, you are no longer chasing something. You are maintaining something you already felt. And that shift destroys momentum, because desire only moves forward when there is tension, a gap, something missing. Resolve, something not yet. But you removed that gap the moment you spoke it, and someone else validated it. You collapsed the distance between where you are and where you imagined yourself to be, without doing the work in between, and your mind accepted it, not as an idea, as an experience. And once something is experienced, it doesn't demand the same urgency. It doesn't pull you forward the same way, because part of you already arrived, not physically, not externally, but psychologically. And that is enough to slow everything down. And this is where most people get stuck permanently, because they don't realize what they're doing. They keep repeating the cycle. New idea, new excitement, new conversation, new validation, same outcome. And every time, it feels like progress. But nothing moves. And the longer this repeats, the harder it becomes to trust yourself. Because now, it's not just about the idea anymore. It's about you. Why do I always do this? Why do I get so close and stop? Why can't I follow through? And that question, if you stay in it long enough, starts to sound like something deeper. Like there's something wrong with you. Like maybe you're just not the kind of person who finishes things. And that belief is exactly what this mechanism protects. Because as long as you think the problem is discipline, you never question what's actually happening. You keep trying harder. Without realizing, you're draining yourself before you even begin. And this is where it becomes more dangerous than you think. Because what you felt in that moment was not just encouragement. It was something much closer to completion, not real completion, but close enough that your system doesn't fully distinguish between the two. Because being seen as someone who is going to do something activates something almost identical to being someone who already did. Not exactly the same, but similar enough to change your behavior. And that similarity is where everything breaks. Because, from a psychological standpoint, your mind is not built to wait for reality. It responds to experience. And if the experience feels real enough, it adjusts immediately without asking for proof. And in that moment, you experienced something you weren't supposed to feel yet. Recognition, validation, certainty. The reaction that should come after the result arrived before the work, and your system accepted it because it has no reason not to. And this isn't a flaw in your character. It's not that you're weak. It's not that you lack discipline. It's something much more precise than that. It's a mechanism that was never meant to operate in this environment, because for most of human history, saying something and doing it were not separate. They were one movement. You declared something, and the group responded. And that response was part of the action. It reinforced it. It pushed it forward. It made it real. But you're not operating in that world anymore. You're not moving inside a tribe that carries your action with you. You're trying to build something alone, quietly, without immediate reinforcement. And in that context, the same mechanism that used to support action now replaces it. Instead of pushing you forward, it satisfies you early. Instead of increasing pressure, it releases it. And the release is subtle. That's what makes it dangerous. It doesn't kill the idea, it softens it. Just enough that urgency fades. Just enough that waiting feels reasonable. Just enough that the thing you felt you had to do immediately now feels like something you can start later, and you don't question it, because it doesn't feel like loss. It feels like stability, like clarity, like confidence. But it isn't. It's discharge. You release the energy that was supposed to move you, and once that energy is gone, the idea stays exactly where it was. Clear, exciting, well-formed, and completely still. And this is where most people get trapped, because they think they're progressing. They talk about it. They refine it. They explain it better each time. It becomes sharper in language, stronger in imagination, more convincing when they say it out loud. But in reality, nothing is moving. And over time, something even worse starts to happen. The idea becomes part of your identity. You're no longer just thinking about doing it. You are the person who is going to do it, at least in your own mind, and in the minds of others. And that illusion is enough to keep you in place for years, because you're no longer chasing something. You're maintaining a version of yourself that already feels real, even if it doesn't exist anywhere that matters. And that's why some of the most intelligent people, the most creative, the ones with the clearest vision, are often the ones who build the least, not because they can't, because they already experienced it too early, too many times, and their system stopped pushing because it thought the work was already in motion. And that's only half of it, because the moment you speak your plan, you don't just affect yourself, you step into something else, something you don't control. You're not just talking to a person, you're stepping into their interior, into everything they've never done, everything they avoided, everything they once wanted, and quietly let go of. And what lives there does not stay passive, because when you speak, something in them responds, not always consciously, not always visibly, but it responds. And this is where it gets uncomfortable, because what you think is support is not always support. What you think is encouragement is not always neutral. Sometimes it's pressure. Sometimes it's comparison. Sometimes it's something they don't even understand themselves. Because when you bring something alive in front of someone, you also bring up everything in them that isn't. And that is where things begin to shift in ways you don't see. And this is where it becomes almost impossible to protect your plan if you don't understand what's actually happening. Because the danger is not obvious. It doesn't look like sabotage. It doesn't feel like resistance. It doesn't come in a form you would reject. It comes in a form you trust. And that's exactly why it works. Because when you tell someone about your plan, you believe you're speaking to them, but you're not. You're speaking to everything they did not become, everything they once considered and quietly abandoned, everything they told themselves was not realistic, not the right time, not worth the risk. And when you speak your plan out loud, you activate that, not intentionally, but precisely. Because your plan is not neutral. It represents movement. It represents change. It represents a direction they once felt and decided not to follow. And that decision did not disappear. It was buried, reframed, justified, and over time, turned into something they now call logic, or maturity, or experience. And when you speak, that structure responds, not consciously, but immediately. And it doesn't come out as rejection. That would be easy to detect. It comes out as guidance, as caution, as reasonable questions. Are you sure this is the right time? Have you really thought this through? That's a big step. That's a risk. And none of these statements are aggressive. None of them feel hostile. In fact, they feel responsible, measured, caring. And that's why you accept them. Because you trust the person. Because you respect them. Because they sound like they're trying to help you. But what you're actually receiving is something else. You're receiving the architecture of the life they didn't live, translated into advice. And that is one of the most dangerous things you can absorb. Because it doesn't feel like limitation. It feels like perspective. And your plan, at this stage, is not stable enough to resist it. It doesn't have structure yet. It doesn't have proof. It doesn't have reality behind it. It exists as tension, as direction, as something forming. And that kind of structure is highly sensitive. It absorbs, it adapts, it shifts. And when doubt enters it, it doesn't reject it. It incorporates it, quietly, without resistance. And before you realize it, something changes. Not the plan itself, the way you relate to it. You start thinking more, questioning more, slowing down. Not because you discovered something new, but because something external entered the system. And once it's inside, it's no longer theirs, it's yours. And that's what makes it so difficult to detect. Because now the hesitation feels internal. It feels like your own thought, your own doubt, your own reasoning. But it wasn't born there. It was introduced, and then integrated. And now, you're no longer moving with the same clarity, because the signal is no longer clean. And this is where it becomes almost impossible to move forward the same way. Because the plan, the one you originally felt, was simple, direct, alive. But now, it's layered, complicated, filled with considerations that weren't there before. And you call that growth. You call that being careful. You call that being strategic. But most of the time, it's interference. And here's what makes this even more precise. Even if the person has no shadow, even if they are genuinely clear, even if they support you completely, something still happens. Because the moment you externalize something internal, you change its nature, completely. Because what was once private, what was once forming in silence, what was once building pressure inside you, is now exposed. And once it's exposed, it's no longer the same thing. Because now it exists. In language, in explanation, in the minds of other people. And the moment that happens, it starts to stabilize prematurely. It starts to become something fixed, instead of something evolving. And that kills something essential. Because real ideas, real plans, don't begin as clarity. They begin as something incomplete, something unresolved, something that forces you to move, because it won't let you stay still. But when you speak it too early, you resolve part of that tension. You give it form before it's ready. You define it before it has grown. And in doing that, you reduce the pressure that was supposed to move you. And without that pressure, there is no movement. And without movement, nothing becomes real. And that's why the plan stays where it is. Not because it's wrong. Not because you're incapable. Because it was exposed too early. And once something is exposed too early, it rarely survives in its original form. And this is where something even more subtle begins to happen. Something most people never notice, even while it's happening inside them. Because the plan doesn't disappear. It doesn't get rejected. It gets adjusted. Quietly. Gradually. Almost invisibly. At first it feels like improvement. You hear a question you hadn't considered, and it makes sense. You hear a suggestion, and it sounds smarter. You hear a concern, and it feels responsible to take it seriously. And none of that feels like interference. It feels like refinement. Like you're making the idea better, more complete, more realistic, more solid. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is dilution. Because every voice you allow into the process pulls the idea slightly away from its origin. Not in a dramatic way, in a precise way. Because the idea, the real one, didn't come from logic. It didn't come from strategy. It didn't come from external input. It came from somewhere deeper, somewhere you didn't fully control, somewhere that didn't ask permission before appearing. And that's exactly what makes it powerful. It belongs to you, in a way nothing else does. Not because you decided it, because it emerged. And when something emerges like that, it carries a specific shape, a specific weight, a specific direction. And that direction is not negotiable, without consequence. Because the moment you start adjusting it, to make it more understandable, more acceptable, more aligned with how other people think, you begin to lose the one thing that made it alive. Its tension, its edge, its force. And this is where most ideas die. Not from rejection, from refinement. Because the more you explain it, the more you soften it. The more you soften it, the more it fits. And the more it fits, the less it demands movement. Until one day, you're left with something that makes sense to everyone and moves no one, including you. And you don't notice when it happens. Because every step along the way felt right, felt intelligent, felt necessary. But the accumulation changes everything. Because now the idea is no longer yours. Not fully. It carries pieces of other people, their logic, their fears, their limits, their sense of what is realistic. And the most dangerous part is that it still feels like yours, but it isn't, not in the way it was. And this is what Jung meant when he spoke about the persona, not as something false, but as something edited, something shaped, to be accepted, to be understood, to be tolerated. And when your idea goes through that same process, it becomes a persona of itself, a presentable version, a version that no longer threatens anyone, a version that no longer scares you. And that's how you know something essential was lost. Because real ideas, the ones that change your life, don't feel comfortable. They don't feel clean. They don't feel fully explainable. They feel unfinished, unstable, a little dangerous. They carry something that doesn't fit yet. And that's exactly why they need protection. Not from the world, but from premature exposure. Because something that is still forming cannot survive being understood too early. It needs something else, something most people completely misunderstand. Silence. Not silence as absence, not silence as waiting, silence as construction. Because in the Jungian sense, silence is not empty, it's active. It's where the psyche does its deepest work. It's where something incomplete is allowed to become whole, without interruption, without explanation, without negotiation. Because the moment you explain something, you fix it, you define it, you limit it, and something that was still evolving stops evolving and becomes a concept instead of a force. Jung compared this process to gestation. not metaphorically, literally. Something is forming inside you. And like anything that forms, it needs protection, time, containment, and above all, it needs to remain untouched until it's strong enough to exist outside of you. Because if you expose it too early, you don't accelerate it, you interrupt it. And once that interruption happens, it rarely returns to its original form. That's why some of your best ideas never became anything. Not because they weren't good enough, because they were exposed before they were ready to survive. And this is the part almost no one is willing to live. Not because it's complicated, but because it's quiet. And quiet doesn't give you anything to show, because the unconscious does not work on your schedule. It doesn't care how ready you feel. It doesn't care how much you want it. It moves slower, deeper, in a direction that doesn't always make sense at the surface. And what comes from that place doesn't arrive finished. It doesn't arrive clear. It arrives as pressure, as a pull, as something you feel before you can explain it. And that stage is fragile, not weak. Fragile, because it's real, but it's not yet stable. It doesn't have structure yet. It doesn't have language. It doesn't have proof. And because of that, it cannot defend itself. Not against doubt. Not against logic. Not against someone asking the right questions. And when something can't defend itself, it absorbs. It bends. It changes. And that's why exposing it too early isn't courage. It's interruption. Because what you're interrupting is formation. And formation requires protection. Not from people, from influence, from noise, from the subtle pressure to explain something that isn't ready to be explained. Because the moment you try to explain it, you reduce it. You translate something alive into something acceptable. And in that translation, something is always lost. That's what silence protects. Not secrecy, not isolation, integrity. Because silence is not about hiding something from others. It's about allowing something to become whole inside you before the world gets access to it. And inside that silence, something happens that cannot happen in conversation. The plan stops being an idea and starts becoming part of you. It integrates, not intellectually, structurally. It begins to shape how you think, how you move, what you prioritize, where your attention goes, even when no one is watching. And that's the difference. Because when something is truly integrated, you don't need to talk about it. You act without needing permission, without needing validation, without needing someone to confirm that you're on the right path. And this is where most people fail. Not because they don't have the idea, because they never allow it to reach that level. They keep exposing it, explaining it, releasing it, before it has weight, before it has roots, before it can survive. And over time, they train themselves into a pattern. Talk, feel progress, stop, talk, feel progress, stop, talk, feel progress, stop, until the mind starts associating talking with doing, and real execution feels heavier, harder, less rewarding, because it doesn't give you anything immediately. No reaction, no approval, no recognition, just resistance and silence. And that's the moment that separates people. Not talent, not intelligence, tolerance for silence. Because when you stop talking, the pressure builds, the energy accumulates, the tension that used to dissolve in conversation has nowhere to go. And when it has nowhere to go, it forces movement, not emotionally, physically, into action. Because the system cannot hold that much unexpressed energy without releasing it somewhere. And if it's not going into words, it goes into execution. That's when things start happening, quietly, without announcement, without anyone knowing, without you needing anyone to know. And for the first time, the plan is not something you describe, it's something you are doing. And that shift changes everything. Because now you're not managing an identity. You're building reality. And reality doesn't respond to how well you explain something. It responds to what you do when no one is watching. And this is where silence becomes power, not absence, direction. Because now, everything inside you is aligned toward one thing, not being seen doing it, but actually doing it. And that is where something deeper begins to take over, something Jung called a vocation. This is where everything stops being about strategy, stops being about discipline, stops being about doing things the right way, because what you're actually dealing with goes much deeper than that. There is a difference between something you want to do and something that won't leave you alone. And you already know the difference, because some ideas feel optional. You can take them or leave them. They come, they go, they don't change how you move. But others don't behave like that. They return, they stay, they follow you into quiet moments. They show up when you're not trying to think about them. They don't ask politely, they press, they insist, and no matter how many times you step away, they come back exactly the same. That's not preference. That's not curiosity. That's something else. Something Jung described with a word most people don't take seriously enough. A calling. Not in the casual sense. Not in the way people talk about passion. Something older than that. More precise. More demanding. A direction that comes from a place inside you. That does not negotiate. It doesn't ask if you're ready. It doesn't check your circumstances. It doesn't adjust to your comfort. It simply points and waits. And the part that makes this uncomfortable is that it doesn't promise anything. It doesn't tell you it will work. It doesn't guarantee success. It doesn't reassure you that it will be worth it. It just continues to exist until you either move toward it or spend your life explaining why you didn't. And that's where most people get trapped. Not because they don't feel it, because they do. They feel it clearly. But almost immediately, they go looking for confirmation, someone to validate it, someone to say, yes, that makes sense. Yes, that's a good idea. Yes, you should do that. And what they call being responsible is actually hesitation, because a real calling cannot be confirmed from the outside. Not because people don't want to help, because they can't see it. It wasn't given to them. It was given to you. It corresponds to something specific in you, your history, your patterns, your potential, your contradictions, everything that makes your path yours and not anyone else's. And because of that, when you try to explain it, it always loses something. It becomes smaller, more logical, more acceptable, and less true. And the moment you start filtering it through other people's understanding, you begin to disconnect from it. Not all at once, gradually, until one day it feels distant, less urgent, less real, and eventually optional. And that's how people lose it. Not because it disappeared, because they stopped protecting it, because they kept bringing it into spaces that were never designed to hold it. And every time they did, they traded clarity for approval. And approval feels good in the moment, but it costs something. It costs direction, because a calling is not something you present. It's something you follow, quietly, without needing anyone to agree, without needing anyone to understand. And this is where silence becomes something else entirely. Not discipline, not strategy, loyalty. Because every time you choose not to explain, not to announce, not to seek permission, you are choosing that voice over everything else. You're saying, this is real enough that I don't need anyone else to believe it yet. And you already know which things in your life carry that weight. The ones that don't excite you loudly, but stay with you. The ones you've explained 100 times and still haven't built. The ones that feel necessary, not impressive. And you also know how many times you've diluted that weight by talking about it too soon, by bringing it into the room before it had the strength to stand on its own. And what that cost you is not a comfortable question, because this is where everything becomes direct. The plans you keep announcing are not waiting for better timing. They are not waiting for more clarity. They are not waiting for the right conditions. They are waiting for you to stop performing them and start protecting them. This is where it becomes uncomfortable, because everything up to this point you could still treat as insight, as understanding, as something interesting to think about. But this part, you can't avoid, because it's not about the idea anymore. It's about you, about the gap between what you say and what you actually do. Because if you're honest, really honest, you don't have a lack of clarity. You don't have a lack of ideas. You don't have a lack of vision. You have evidence, a lot of it, in every plan you've described in detail, but never built. In every conversation where you felt momentum, but produced nothing after. In every version of your future that exists perfectly in your words and nowhere else. And at some point, you have to stop explaining that. You have to stop refining it. You have to stop giving it better language and ask something much more direct. How much of what I call ambition is actually being released in conversation instead of converted into action? Because that's the mechanism. That's the pattern. And it's not obvious. Because it feels productive. It feels like movement. It feels like you're getting closer. But you're not. You're maintaining the identity of someone who is going to do something without becoming the person who does it. And those are not the same. Not even close. Because one is social. It exists in how you're perceived, in how you're seen, in how convincingly you can describe the future. The other is real. It exists in what you build when no one is watching. And most people stay in the first one, not because they choose to, because it's easier, because it's rewarded, because it gives them enough satisfaction to delay the harder thing. And that delay is what costs years, not lack of talent, not lack of opportunity. Delay, repeated, normalized, justified, until one day, you look at your life and realize nothing actually moved. And that's the part you can't ignore anymore. Because this isn't about becoming secretive. It's not about hiding everything. It's not about cutting people off. It's about something much deeper. Sovereignty. The ability to hold something real inside you, without needing it to be seen, approved, or understood, before you act on it. Because the moment you need that, you've already given control away. And what you're left with is not direction. It's dependency. And dependency does not build anything. So this is where the decision happens. Not out there, not later, right here. You either continue the pattern, talking, explaining, releasing the pressure, and staying exactly where you are, or you do something different. You stop announcing, you stop explaining, you stop performing progress, and you begin, quietly, without witnesses, without validation, without needing to feel ready. Because readiness is another version of delay. And the truth is simple, brutally simple. The plans you keep talking about are not waiting for better conditions. They are waiting for you to stop talking about them and start protecting them long enough to make them real. If something in this hit you, not in a comfortable way, but in a way you recognize, leave that recognition in the comments. Not the plan, not what you're going to do. Just the moment you realized you already knew this, and now you can't ignore it anymore. And if you're still here, then this isn't where it ends. This is where it actually starts.